one exercise that can improve your spine health. We're going to be looking at that exercise. We're also going to be looking at what it's doing and how it's improving the health of your spine. Then we're going to look at some common faults, because there's a lot of things that people can get wrong with this exercise. And then we're going to try and fix those faults as we work through the tutorial. If you're suffering with lower back pain and you want to improve the health of your lower back or the health of your spine, then please do just click the link below. You'll go through to my online coaching and consultation, where we will go through and create a bespoke lower back pain rehabilitation program for you. All you have to do is answer 2 questionnaires. We'll get you booked in for the consultation, where I'll get some more information from you. We'll set you up with the online assessment as well. All that information will then help me build the program, which I will then send to you via PDF, video and audio if necessary. The exercise we're going to talk about today is the bird dog. It's an exercise that I talk about a lot, but I talk about it for very good reason. Obviously, we're talking about it with regards to maintaining the health of your spine, because a lot of the exercises that people choose, mainly the back extending type of exercises, which can be just extending the body or extending the arm and the leg whilst you're led on the floor. All of those different types of exercises can cause unnecessary stress to the lower back. So what we're going to talk about is the bird dog and why it's better than those exercises, and how to complete that exercise effectively in the next couple of parts of the tutorial. So there's 3 main benefits that we get from the bird dog. Number 1 is the muscle activation. So when we come down onto all fours and we lift the opposite arm and leg, obviously what we don't want to be doing is overarching or being in the rounded position, because that's going to affect the muscle activation. We want to maintain that neutral posture. So we come down and we come into this position. Now what this is doing is this is optimizing the muscle activation. When you do a back extension or a spine extending exercise, that activates muscles on both sides of the spine. Now all that's doing is creating, certainly in a troublesome back, if you have a healthy back, there may be some place for it, but I would still categorize it as unnecessary, because there's plenty of other exercises that will do just as good a job and won't necessarily have the negative effects of spine extending exercises. So certainly if you've got back troubles, the back extension type exercise or spine extending exercises will put unnecessary compression around the spine. So it's activating on just one side of the spine, which is optimizing and essentially halving the compression around the spine. So it's much better for that muscle activation. So when we come into here, obviously we've got sort of the lats and the spinal extensors, and then we've got glute max, glute medius working on this side. So again, it's managing that activation across the spine. Number 2, I've sort of introduced already, but it's the compression around the spine. Now, the compression around the spine that I've already introduced is essentially, if you can imagine that I'm holding onto a sponge in my fist and then I squeeze it tighter. So the sponge is your spine, my hand is your muscles. So all that's happening when we go into that spine extension type position is it's putting that excess compression around the spine. And again, as I mentioned, if the spine is in a troublesome state, then that's not going to be necessarily that effective for it. What's also happening when we extend the spine, we've got little joints on the back of our spine called facet joints, and they can get compressed as well. So when we go into the spine extension type exercises, that can compress there, that can create inflammation, and that can create its own problems. Now, when we do the online consultation and coaching, we can identify what your pain triggers are. So is a back extension triggering your pain? Or can we understand that you have facet joint inflammation, and every time you do a back extension, it's causing you pain? Or it may not be causing you pain at the time, it's causing you pain afterwards. Those are all the types of things that we can look at during the consultation. But part number 2, or number 2, is the compression around the spine, and we're able to optimize it due to the muscle activation that I talked about before. And number 3, it's stabilizing the hip, the spine, and the shoulders. So what we can do with the bird dog is we come into this position, we obviously lift one arm and a leg, or one arm and the opposite leg, and we want to maintain level hips and level shoulders. So that shows that we've got relatively good stability through there, but I'm using a relatively wide base. If I come narrower, then my hips have got to work harder, my shoulders have got to work harder, and therefore my spine has to work a little bit harder to maintain that level shoulder and level hip. Because what can happen is you can get wobbling, and that just shows the muscles are trying to catch themselves. So they're constantly contracting and relaxing to try and catch you and keep that stability. So it's great once we can get that smooth for that hip, spine and shoulder stability. Now the common mistakes. We're going to cover 3. There are more, but I'm just going to cover 3 because we're going to solve it in a particular way in a second. Number 1 is just being lazy when you do it. So what we want to try and get when we perform this exercise is muscle activation through the abdominals. We will get it through the spinal extensors when we lift the arm and the leg and maintain that neutral posture. So we'll get that, and we also want a little bit of lats and also glute maximus medius as well. And how we do that is essentially we come into that strong position. Now we're going to talk a little bit about in a second how we can get some lat engagement. The glute extension, or the glute activation, we can get by just extending through here, not overly extending, but just extending and getting that activation through here. Because when people are lazy, yes, they're going into the position, but they're not really getting what they need from it, and they're just kind of going through the motions. So yes, they are performing a bird dog exercise, but they're not necessarily doing it that well. So by maintaining the proper position of the arm, and you can also screw the shoulder in, then it's much easier to get the lat activation and the rotator cuffs involved as well as the spinal extensors and glute max. So just by maintaining that proper position, clench your fist as well, externally rotate, that's getting all the shoulders engaged. Now what can happen, and when we talk about it in a second, when we talk about the fixes for these faults, we're going to try and sort of, instead of having to necessarily consciously do all of that, what we're going to try and do is build it in, so then eventually you can just drop in and do everything that I'm talking about. Number 2 is the weight shifting and the sort of the rolling of the hips and shoulders that I've sort of mentioned already. So again, what can happen if people are lazy, they might just be hips sort of rolling from side to side, weight shifting, rotating and all that kind of business. Again, that's what we want to try and avoid. So again, it's all of the information that I talked about before, getting the arm and screwing it in, getting the leg, getting the knee straight, getting the hip extended to a point but not extending the spine. So extending the hip but not the spine. So there's all these things that we need to build in to try and fix these types of faults. Because again, these faults where they may be performing the exercise is not really doing them any good at all. The third one, I've kind of mentioned it already just through talking about everything else, but also we've got the overextending. That again is something that we want to avoid. Again, if people are being lazy, they can overextend because they just come up too high. That can encourage the weight shifts that I've talked about as well. So again, we want to be trying to make that position much more effective. And what we're going to do in the next part is we're going to find that effective position in some respects without really having to consciously think about it, because we just kind of want our body to do it. But when we can use certain things, use certain instruments or tools, then we can get there without all of the thought process and trying to balance and everything that comes along with it. Because it is an exercise that you kind of need to think through as you're doing it, rather than just doing the exercise like I've described when you're being lazy. So we need to think about what we're doing as we're doing it. The 2 fixes we're going to use is the band and the dumbbells. Now we're going to use them both for the upper body, but you can use it for the lower body to get the glutes activated. But just for the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to do it with the upper body at the moment, because that's the least likely place that people will focus on when they do this exercise. They can focus on this area and get that tight. They've got more chance of focusing on the glutes, but they tend not to focus too much on what the shoulders are doing. So we're going to get good muscle activation. It's going to help us get that position, so we're able to get much more out of this exercise. So with regards to the dumbbells, it's very simple. So what we're doing here is I'm just going to hold on to them and I'm going to do exactly the same, because what we want is an activation through the arm, because when we get an activation through the arm, we essentially trigger the upper back to start working. So we're just going to use some light dumbbells. What we've got is two things. A lot of people use it to lift the weight, and that is true. Lifting the weight will help the muscle activation, but if we've got something to grip on tight to, then we're going to get much more from the shoulder. If we're getting into the right position, but we've got the open hand, then we're not getting as much out of the shoulder as we could. So just using a light weight will help us grip onto it, and we'll get a little bit more from the shoulder. So we come into this position, it's exactly the same, and then we come up here. Now we've obviously got the activation through the shoulder because we've got a 2 kilo weight that we're using with a long lever. So we've got that part of it. The next thing that we need to do is push the shoulder down into the rib cage. So what we can do is just turn the hand up. That will just activate the external rotators, and it will get a little bit of Latissimus dorsi in there as well. So that's the first fix that we can use. And what it does is, because the weight's there, people can't really be lazy. Because the weight's there, they have to consciously think about what they're doing. So we can get that weight into position. They have to work to get it there, albeit only a light weight, but they have to work all the same. It's much harder to do than it is just without the weight. So we've got the dumbbells there to be able to help us get the activation through the grip strength, the activation through the long lever, and the conscious thought of what's going on in the arm as well. Second is using the band. Now the band we're going to use slightly differently, but for, in some respects, the same sort of reasons. Now what we're going to use this for is trying to get a little bit more in the way of a Latissimus dorsi activation, which is the big muscle going down the side. This is a great spine stabilizer because it basically spans the whole length of the back. It's very tendinous in the lower back, but the muscle activation above it will help maintain a strong position at the low back. So what we can do, to get lat activation, we need to pull in this position out here. Now I'll start getting a little bit of lat activation as I do that. I can feel that, now I'm locked on. So all I'm doing is when I lift, is I'm using this band to try and pull my arm in, which shuts it off. But I want to counter that by pulling it out. So I go into this position, and then I'm holding. So I now know I'm getting that lat activation. I'm also getting shoulder and upper back activation as well. So all we're using there is counteracting the position of the band to hold it out. We're getting a little bit of grip strength, not as much as the dumbbell, but we're getting a little bit of grip strength, but mainly we're feeling through the lats. So depending on what you need, depends on which instrument or tool you would use, be it the dumbbell or the resistance band. But what we are doing is getting much more out of the upper body and activating the muscles much more effectively when we perform the bird dog, and we're going to get much more from it because we're not being lazy with it, and we're trying to focus on specific parts of the body to be able to perform it correctly. If you found this helpful and you do want some help with your lower back problems, please do just click the link below, go through to my online consultation and coaching, and get yourself signed up, and I'll be in touch with your questionnaires and then eventually to get you booked in for your consultation. So many thanks for watching. My name's Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.